Social media is full of videos of teachers speaking about burnout and how their job has negatively impacted their mental
Mm.
health, right? In my perception or my belief is a police officer's job is actually harder than the teacher. Um, how did being a police officer impact your mental health?
Man, that's a good question. The burnout's real. It's real because there's no real structure to how officers deal with the trauma that they face in the profession. People ask me questions all the time about what's the worst thing you've seen. I've seen a lot of death, seen a lot of trauma, a lot of sadness, the whole 9 yards. And the next day, you got to go right back to work. Or in some cases, the first hour of your shift, you're dealing with a murder, and then an hour later, you got to go right back, and now you're handling some issues with kids, you're handling a domestic, or you're doing a shoplifting call. There's no, there's there hasn't they haven't put together, I would say, a very effective plan on how to deal with officers experiencing trauma on the job. Something that gives officers an opportunity to separate themselves from the job for a couple of days. It's like you're constantly turning them over from hour to hour to hour. It's a 24-hour job. When do you have downtime? How do you even examine the mentality of the psychosis of an officer after they've experienced so much? And a lot of times you deal with so much you don't realize you even have the trauma until later down the line, or a couple years later. You're just taught to kind of just push through it and continue to go. But to this day, you have some departments, they put together little programs. But again, the biggest issue in this country is that there's nothing uniform. There's nothing consistent across the board to help officers deal with these type of traumas. And ultimately, it causes issues. You see this thing play out within their families. You see these things play out when they encounter other people. They get triggered. And what ends up happening is you have officers that'll stay on the road for, when I mean the road, they're actually road officers for 10, 15, 20 years. And even just that consistent, day in, day out, dealing with these calls, dealing with people, it drains you, it burns you out, and it makes you ineffective. And that's how you have these officers that tend to snap and lose their cool and things like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, man, shouldn't they create a process where them knowingly you did a certain amount of time on the road, you should be removed because they know
Absolutely.
how impactful it is?
Absolutely. I think that, so I put together a lot of reform ideas to present to like city officials and police departments, kind of ideas that they haven't really thought of. What people don't realize, it's expensive to run a police department. They also don't realize that a lot of people don't want to do the job. And so there's a need for more officers. So they think, I have the impression that less is more. You just need quality over quantity. And then you need to reduce the amount of calls that officers, or the type of calls that officers are responding to. So remember I told you 80% of those calls we don't need to respond to? Well, if that's the case, then guess what? You don't need such a large police force. What you need is a social unit to handle a lot of those social calls where you're showing up and you're there to actually service people, not enforce the law, but to provide a service. That's what the people need. But when you reduce the police force and you focus on high priority crimes, or like we would call the 7 deadly sins, those are very specific crimes. The majority of what police departments really need is more investigators and less actual patrol officers, because a lot of the crimes already occurred. The officers are there just collecting evidence. Well, if that's the case, we need more investigators, and their job is more indoor in order to solve crime. But the calls of service, you can have a separate unit for that. So I think one of the biggest challenges is officers need downtime, and you need downtime to actually train and stay in shape. 99% of the police departments actually have a physical fitness requirement. Once you pass a physical fitness exam, then that's it. You're not required to pass it again, which is crazy. But the reality is there's an exam for shooting every year. You got to pass twice. And if you can't shoot properly, then you can't police. So it shows you where the priority is. The priority is pulling the trigger versus being able to use your hands. And that's one of the biggest problems in law enforcement today. These officers don't know how to fight.
I wanna I want to finish up with this mental health, and I want to get
Okay.
back to that investigation, right? So I saw statistics that stated male officers have a 76% rate of divorce and female officers 84%. Have you witnessed this in your life?
I would say, so I'm not married, but I will say that data, that information that they put out, that information has been pushed out for years now. That's actually outdated information. And the way that or I would say the way that was actually done, that research was done in like a bubble. It was a very small
in a big
sample
sample
size.
size, all right.
Yeah, and so they've used that and perpetuated that for years. And to this day, they still do it. They say, well, police are the most violent. If you marry them, same thing they say about, those who are Jamaican. They're like, oh, if you're a Jamaican man, is violent. These things aren't true, and it's not accurate. The reality is, if you look at the CDC report, it'll show you that that divorce amongst law enforcement is actually below the national average, way below the national average. As we know, the national average, I believe, is 50% divorce rate. Law enforcement is actually below that. But that doesn't mean there's not challenges. There are unique challenges with dating someone or marrying someone that is in law enforcement. As you can imagine, the long hours, the stressful job, the trauma, maybe some officers don't communicate well. Those things, I've experienced those things, personal dating. One of the biggest issues I've had is actually getting someone who understands my schedule. It's very, I don't have a
Random,
random schedule. I've made plans to do things, and then those plans have to get canceled. And that's just a part of the business, right, of policing. And so, unfortunately, if you have a chick, she's not really supportive, not understanding, you're going to have a hard time. I've seen people have better success, those who are married going into law enforcement versus those trying to find marriage while they are police officers. A lot of times we tend to date either other officers or people who work a very stressful job. We tend to pair well. You see a lot of officers dating nurses. I dated a lot of nurses. That's been very successful for me because we both have 24-hour jobs, and they're very understanding. So, but there are issues. But abuse and all those things, that there's no data, no empirical data that supports that because the person's an officer that you're more likely to be abused or you're more likely to be divorced. What they do know, though, based on the data, according to the CDC, is that divorce rates are below the national average for police officers.